Hey y'all! Now that we're 2 weeks into New World's first expansion, I wanted to take a more complete look at the heavy spear build I use for soloing elite chest areas, expeditions, and occasionally low to mid-level mutations, relying on high values of Fortify for mitigation and life-stealing for sustained self-healing. I want to be clear going in, this is what works for me. More experienced players might be doing something completely different, but if you like what you see, I really hope you enjoy it as much as I do. This is the build I run, and the skills I've picked are Skewer, Perforate, and Vault Kick. Since attributes and equip loads no longer affect the cost of dodging, and because they've nerfed Invigorating Crits a while back to only give stamina once per action that crits, rather than from every critical hit, our stamina income isn't nearly what it used to be. This is a major reason why I'm back to running heavy, so I can eat the smaller hits and reserve stamina to dodge heavy attacks. Without grit, dodging and finding safe opportunities to use abilities leaves me without much of a rotation. Instead, it's a simple priority. Assuming I have the perk Fortifying Perforate, I use Perforate almost whenever it's up, delaying only if I need to dodge something first, or if I'm about to get stunned or staggered, which would interrupt it. Skewer is mostly for damage, and Vault Kick is for the stun, the empowerment, or more importantly, the reduction on all spear cooldowns every time it hits. The most notable mastery points are the ones that grant stamina, cooldown reduction, or affect the cost of dodging. So even if I'm not running an opal in my spear, dodging regularly is a major part of the self-sustain. Otherwise, I spend most of my time between perforates and dodging, just doing whatever gets me the most cooldown reduction. Dodging less than 2 seconds before an ability takes 20% off all spear cooldowns, thanks to aggressive maneuvers. And dodging backwards less than 2 seconds after a hit consumes 20% less stamina, thanks to evasive maneuvers. Using 2 light attacks in a row reduces remaining cooldowns by another 10% thanks to refreshing jabs, and landing a hit with Vault Kick reduces remaining cooldowns by another 30% with continuous motion, though it doesn't get pressed as much as it should since I'm filling a lot of that time with Perforate, Skewer, or double light attacks to get those off cooldown. Another reason I don't press Vault Kick as often as I can is because it's really punishing attempting a Vault Kick only to miss or get interrupted, and even less worthwhile if the enemy's immune to stun. Especially when I'm getting body blocked or pushed around by a bunch of enemies at once, I'll often use Vault Kick and slide right off my target, or I'll get shoved away so that I miss entirely. This is where everybody who has suggested I take Sweep instead of Vault Kick might be onto something, but I'm gonna tough it out because when Vault Kick works, it really works. Moving on to perks, I always make sure to have all 3 perks that amplify my spear skills. That's Fortifying Perforate, which I already mentioned, Enfeebling Skewer, which adds a weaken component to Skewer, and Keen Vault Kick that adds a crit proc, meaning more stamina from invigorating crits, and extended uptime on spear debuffs through exacerbating crits. Both Fortifying Perforate and Enfeebling Skewer can be extremely powerful on a spear as opposed to armor, but there are a couple major caveats to consider. First, it's much harder to maintain Enfeebling Skewer on multiple enemies at once than it is to maintain Fortifying Perforate on yourself, even in ideal conditions. Second, there's a thing called debuff resilience that kicks in when you're fighting bosses in mutated 2s and 3s. Assuming I understand this correctly, this nerfs individual applications of weaken by 75% against these bosses, making Enfeebling Skewer a lot less reliable for mitigation compared to what it used to be. That being said, on single-target bosses in M1 or lower, it could still be more effective to have Enfeebling on a spear and Fortifying on armor, but I still say a spear with Fortifying Perforate gives you better rounded mitigation in almost all situations. Now this is a personal choice, but even with Ghoul's Harmony and Leeching coming from the artifact Blood Drinker, I really like Life Stealing for my second spear perk. I didn't think I would since the ring already gives so much, but after seeing the damage I take in M2s, I'm willing to suffer the damage loss and just keep stacking it higher. I don't think there are any make or break third perks on a spear for soloing, but after playing with a few different perks, I'm actually leaning towards Shirking Nature, especially if we're talking single target fights. Unlike a lot of perks that got nerfed in the expansion, Shirking Elemental procs got a major buff, so if you're like me and dodge a lot, the damage really adds up. Still, there's nothing wrong with more general perks like Arboreal Attunement, Vicious, Keen, Keenly Jagged, or Keenly Empowered. Even Mortal Fortification could be good in certain spots like bigger trash packs in Starstone where things were dying frequently, meaning less incoming damage, but less life stealing as well as the fight goes on. Either way, there are a lot of decent third perks, but crafting a spear with 3 guaranteed perks costs a ton of mats, while 2 is much more affordable. For armor, once I've got my other 2 spear perks covered, I like to prioritize up to 5 stacks of Enchanted Ward for mitigation, and exactly 4 stacks of Refreshing for even better uptime. With how expensive it is to get Adamant right now, I can understand passing on health, but if you can get lucky or can afford it, more hit points never hurts. For my amulet, Fortified and Stamina recovery are majorly important, and for the third perk I would look for either health or Refreshing recovery, depending on your preferences. Passage of Time is actually a pretty decent placeholder, which you can make using dense Lazarus materia from the Season Pass, or from farming Laz. For my ring, I obviously chose Blood Drinker, which is the artifact. Until you can get that, a good placeholder would be one with Leeching and Hardy. If you've got enough dense mutator materia from the Season Pass, or from mutators themselves, you can make an Azoth crystal ring pretty easily. Then on an earring, I only really care about regenerating, though you might consider it overkill in a build with so much self-healing already. Ideally, I'd pair that with Refreshing Toast and Fortifying Toast, though neither are absolutely essential. And while I'm still talking about gearing, I want to point out that completing the Season Pass gets you enough free materia to make the things I've listed, plus an Azoth crystal helm and greaves. Maybe even the breastplate too, depending on what you're planning to use for your artifact armor. I tried to spend my materia on slots that would have been really expensive to craft, so that I could use my Azoth Inductor on gloves and boots, which take far fewer materials. Now I want to talk about secondary weapons and artifacts. I used to swear by Void Gauntlet as my secondary, but now that multiple sources of lifestealing are available, and Fortifying Perforate requires me to keep my spear drawn, I wouldn't recommend Void Gauntlet except in niche situations, or very early on if you don't have any lifestealing. Essence Rupture can be pretty good for stamina and health regen if you can weave it in between spear abilities, while Oblivion offers brief empowerment and increased stamina regen for a few seconds. The artifact Void Gauntlet Life Taker scales with Dex, so there's definitely more room for build diversity with a spear and Void Gauntlet than there used to be, but for now it's just not my speed. Right now I'm actually using a bow as my second with Poison Shot, Rain of Arrows, and Rapid Shot. For expeditions and mutators, I mainly use it to pull, while in open world or ECRs, I'll sometimes replace poison with evade shot, just so I have access to stagger and can weave in and out of melee whenever I like. Either way, this weapon brings a really well-rounded damage profile for most content I find myself in, so it's my default secondary for that reason. If I don't need access to ranged abilities, sometimes I'll run a flail as my secondary. The artifact Odo, in particular, has a perk increasing damage taken by stunned enemies by 20% with both weapons, which has a tiny bit of synergy with Vault Kick, but nothing huge. What's nice about the flail is Warding Bludgeon, which gives 8 seconds or 3 hits worth of reinforced Fortify that persists through weapon swaps. You don't even have to hit an enemy to proc the Fortify. You can hit the ground with it, swap back to your spear, and then run in. This might seem like overkill, but it's really nice to have access to even more Fortify. A flail also gives reinforced vitality, which is just a bit of extra health even when it's sheathed. You can max out points in Arcane Smite for some weaken, a little more lifestealing, and stagger or fortify depending on your shield type. I've also put points in Arcane Vortex for a little on-demand access to haste and CC cleansing, which I'm sure will come in handy. My last recommendation is a Warhammer for stuns and staggers where needed, but what I really want to talk about is the artifact Spark of Mjolnir, which gives me a pretty nice idea for a lightning build. Since Spark of Mjolnir increases lightning damage done with both weapons by 20%, I could replace the gem in my spear with Runeglass of Electrified Topaz, the gems in my armor with Runeglass of Electrified Onyx, and I could try to find gear, if possible, with Lightning Harnessing, and a spear with Shirking Lightning for even more lightning damage. This could be good against Ancients, since they're vulnerable to lightning, but I'll be honest, I'm really just looking for an excuse to add lightning sound and visual effects to my spear. Either way, I'm definitely excited to try this out once we get our first week of mutated Laz, so I can farm for it. As for other artifacts, I've already mentioned Blood Drinker, which is central to my build, but for armor I'm looking at Void Darkplate for its straightforward 20% increase to armor. In the meantime, I've been using Tumbler Foot Wraps from the Season Pass while I wait for mutated barnacles to rotate in, even though they're light and they don't always proc when they should. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get magnetic gauntlets from Mutated Tempest before it rotated out, but I imagine it works well in fights where you need to dodge more than mitigate, since more crits means more stamina. Still, the nerf to crit damage could have a severe impact on how much damage and lifestealing I'd get from the rest of the build, so that's why I really wanted to test it out. Generally speaking, I like to run Runeglass of Arboreal Opal on my spear and Punishing Onyx on everything else, but that's just because that's what I find useful in most situations. For attributes, I like 350 Dex, 100 Strength, and 100 Con, which I feel gives me plenty of unconditional buffs to physical damage and mitigation. While the 350 Dex perk gives me a CC break on weapon swap, which covers a lot of my mistakes, I still prefer running Brutal Stoneform as my Heartrune, since it doesn't trigger an animation lock or interfere with my rotation in any way. It's a few seconds of grit on demand, plus immunity to CCs, plus a small burst of damage, which also equals health in a life-stealing build. All around just a great ability to have available. And with that, I think I've covered most of how my build works. Eventually I want to try and make a second set, so that I can slot in elemental gems and maybe take a crack at M3 if I'm feeling spicy, but I wouldn't call it a priority. I wanted a build that would work for solo progression, and I think I've got it. That being said, I hope this was informative to anyone new to the build, or at least covered some new ground for anyone who's already seen my videos. Sorry if this one was a bit longer than it needed to be, I just wanted to cover all my bases. Let me know in the comments if there's anything I left out or that I could explain better, and I'll give it my best shot. Until next time, thanks so much for watching. Have a good one.